Westbrook Tower, a 68-story skyscraper of steel and ambition towering above Manhattan, was battered by the rain. Alexander Westbrook stood facing away from the door of his corner office, watching the drips fly down the window. His recent ranking as the 12th richest person in America by Forbes was meaningless today. "Mr. Westbrook," came the crackling voice of his assistant over the intercom. "Someone has come to visit you. She is really demanding even though she doesn't have an appointment." Alexander didn't look back. "Tell her to make an appointment like everyone else." "Sir, I tried. It's about Catherine Lewis," she claims. The name struck him like a blow to the body. It had been 20 years since he'd heard it said out loud. Slowly turning, Alexander's face was meticulously crafted into the expression of apathy he had mastered over decades of intense negotiations. Centered in. The girl that walked into his office was perhaps 22 years old, wearing a rain-soaked overcoat that had seen better days, and her dark hair put back in a simple ponytail. Her sneakers were scratched and her pants old, but it was her eyes that drew his attention, intelligent and deep brown. They studied him with an intensity that unnerved him. "5 minutes," he said without extending an invitation to sit. She straightened up. "Maya Lewis is my name. My mother was Catherine Lewis." Like a blade between his ribs, the past tense registered. Maya went on, her voice firm despite the emotion he could see growing behind her eyes. "She died 3 weeks ago," she said. "Cancer of the pancreas. She instructed me to find you before she passed away." Almost gradually, Alexander's fingers tightened on the edge of his desk. "I'm sorry for your loss, but it's been more than 20 years since I last saw Catherine. I'm not sure what you believe I can accomplish for you." Maya hurriedly stated, "I'm not here for money," with a hint of pride on her face. "I'm here because my mother made me promise to give you this." She carefully placed the worn leather journal she had taken out of her suitcase on his desk. Alexander did not touch it. He just stared at it. "What is this?" "I'm not sure. I never got her to let me read it." She simply stated that having it is crucial. Maya's tone grew softer. "She also said to tell you she was sorry, and that she never stopped loving you." Alexander's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. He'd built an empire from nothing, made and lost billions, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. "How do I know you're who you say you are?" he asked, his voice cold despite the storm raging inside him. Maya reached back into her bag and pulled out a faded photograph. She kept this always. The photograph showed a younger version of himself, with his arm around a beautiful woman, the same eyes as the girl standing before him. They were laughing, carefree, standing on a beach at sunset. He remembered that day perfectly, the day before everything fell apart. "Leave your contact information with my assistant," he said finally, not trusting himself to say more. "I'll have someone verify your identity." "I don't need anything from you," Maya said, her chin lifting slightly. "I made a promise to my mother, and I've kept it. The rest is up to you." She turned to leave, her shoulders straight despite the weight he could see she carried. "Wait," he said, surprising himself. "How did she die?" Maya turned back, her expression softening slightly. Quickly, at the end, "I was with her. Her last words were your name." The silence that followed felt endless. 20 years of questions crowded his mind. "I work at Moretti's Cafe on West 43rd, Maya said finally. "If you want to talk about her, I'm there most mornings." After she left, Alexander stood motionless, staring at the journal on his desk. He didn't open it, couldn't open it, until hours later, when the office had emptied and the city lights sparkled against the night sky. The first page contained just one line in Catherine's familiar handwriting. "Alexander, there are truths you deserve to know." 3 days later, Alexander stood outside Moretti's Cafe, watching through the window as Maya moved efficiently behind the counter, serving customers with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked tired, he thought. The weight of grief was visible in the slump of her shoulders when she thought no one was looking. He'd had her investigated, of course. Maya Lewis, 22. Born in Boston, raised by a single mother. Straight a student who'd won a scholarship to NYU, but had to drop out after 2 years when her mother got sick. No criminal record. Currently working 2 jobs to pay off medical bills. And absolutely, without question, Catherine's daughter. What the investigation couldn't tell him was whether she was his. Inside the cafe, Maya looked up and saw him. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by surprise. She hadn't expected him to come. He hadn't expected it either. Yet here he was. The journal burned a hole in his pocket. He stepped inside, the smell of coffee and pastries enveloping him. It was a world away from the rarefied air of his corporate headquarters. Maya approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came," she said simply. "I read the journal," he replied. Maya nodded, her expression guarded. "And I'd like to talk. When is your break?" "I get off at 2 today. I'll wait." Maya's eyebrows rose slightly. "You'll wait for 3 hours." "I've waited 20 years, he said. 3 hours is nothing." As promised, Alexander waited, taking a small table in the corner, ignoring the curious glances from other customers. The man in the $5,000 suit was clearly out of place among the students and office workers who frequented the cafe. His phone buzzed constantly, but he ignored it. For the first time in decades, the empire he'd built could wait. At precisely 2 o'clock, Maya emerged from the back. Her apron was gone, her hair loose around her shoulders. She hesitated, then approached his table. "There's a park nearby," she said. "We could walk." The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean. They walked in silence for several minutes before Alexander spoke. "Your mother's journal explains why she left," he said finally, "but not why she never told me about you." Maya stopped walking. "She thought you wouldn't want me, that a child would interfere with your ambitions." She looked at him directly. Was she wrong? The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of choices made and paths not taken. 20 years ago, would he have chosen differently? He honestly didn't know. "I never married," he said instead. "Never had children." "That doesn't answer my question," Maya said quietly. Before Alexander could respond, a passing cyclist swerved to avoid a puddle, sending a spray of water over them both. Maya stepped back with a surprised laugh, then stopped abruptly when she saw his expression. "You have her laugh," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Something shifted in Maya's eyes. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. The barrier between them, built of years and secrets and regret, didn't fall, but a small crack appeared. "I'd like to know more about her," Alexander said. "The Catherine I knew. And I'd like to know more about you." "Why?" The word was barely a whisper. Alexander looked at the young woman before him, Catherine's daughter, perhaps his daughter, and felt something. Something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Possibility. "Because," he said simply, "some truths deserve to be known." The weeks that followed were a careful dance of discovery. Alexander and Maya met twice more at the park near Moretti, their conversations starting awkwardly but gradually easing into something less guarded. He learned she had her mother's talent for photography, though she'd never had the money for proper equipment, and her passion for obscure jazz records. He discovered she'd been accepted to 3 Ivy League schools, but chose NYU to stay close to Catherine. Maya, in turn, learned about the young man her mother had loved. Ambitious but idealistic, driven but capable of spontaneity, so different from the polished billionaire who now commanded one of the largest private companies in America. "What happened?" she asked one afternoon as they sat on a bench watching children play. Mom's journal explained why she left, but not what happened to you afterward. Alexander was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distance. "I became who I needed to be to survive." "At what cost?" Maya's question wasn't accusatory, merely curious. He turned to look at her then, struck again by how much she resembled Catherine, not just physically, but in her directness, her unflinching gaze. "Everything," he admitted. "But we're not here to talk about me." "Aren't we?" Maya challenged. "If I'm—" She stopped herself. The unspoken question hung between them. Neither had directly addressed the possibility of their biological connection, though it shadowed every interaction. At their fourth meeting, Alexander brought a small box. "These belong to your mother," he said, placing it between them. "I kept them all these years." Inside was a collection of photographs Catherine had taken during their time together, landscapes, street scenes, and a few of Alexander himself, looking younger and far less guarded than the man he'd become. "She was talented," he said softly. "Yes," Maya agreed, carefully examining each photo. She never stopped taking pictures, even when her hands shook too badly to hold the camera steady. She paused, her fingers hovering over one particular image. This one. She had a copy of this. It was by her bed until the day she died. The photograph showed a sunrise over the ocean, the light breaking through storm clouds. Nothing remarkable to an ordinary observer, but Alexander remembered exactly where and when it had been taken, the morning after he first told Catherine he loved her. "I'd like to see where she lived," Alexander said suddenly. "Would you show me?" The apartment in Brooklyn was small but neat, the walls covered with Catherine's photographs. Evidence of her illness had been cleared away, but traces remained: a hospital bed in the corner of the living room, prescription bottles in the bathroom cabinet, a calendar on the refrigerator marked with treatment appointments. Maya moved through the space with practiced efficiency, making tea in the tiny kitchen while Alexander took in the life Catherine had built without him. "She was happy, you know," Maya said, handing him a chipped mug. "Not at the end, of course, but before. She loved her work, her friends. She loved me." She hesitated. She didn't regret her life, just parts of it. Alexander said quietly, his eyes falling on a framed photograph of Catherine holding a newborn Maya. "Yes." Maya sat across from him, cradling her own mug. "In her journal, did she explain why she left?" Alexander nodded slowly. "She said my ambition was becoming destructive, that I was crossing lines I'd once promised never to cross. Was she right?" "Yes." The admission cost him something. "I told her it was temporary, just until I secured our future. She didn't believe me." Would she have been right about that too? Alexander didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was heavy with rare honesty. "Probably. I became consumed. The company became everything. And now you're worth, what? 12 billion? 13? There was no judgment in Maya's tone, only curiosity. "Something like that," he said dismissively. "It stopped mattering a long time ago." "When did it stop mattering?" Alexander looked up, meeting her gaze. "About 3 weeks ago, when a young woman walked into my office and told me her mother had died." Something shifted in Maya's expression. A softening, a recognition. For the first time, she looked at him not as Alexander Westbrook, Billionaire CEO, but as a man who had loved and lost her mother. Later that evening, as they walked back toward the subway station, Maya stopped abruptly. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." Alexander nodded, bracing himself. "What do you want from me?" Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "Why are you really here? Is it guilt? Curiosity? Or are you trying to determine if I'm going to make a claim on your fortune?" "I don't know," he admitted. It was, perhaps, the most honest thing he'd said in years. "When I read your mother's journal, He paused, struggling for words. "There are pieces of my life missing, Maya. I can't get those years back, but perhaps I can understand them better." Maya studied him, weighing his answer. "The journal doesn't say if you're my father." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." "Does that matter to you?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Did it matter? 20 years ago, it would have terrified him. Now, I don't know, he said again. "Does it matter to you?" Maya looked away, her profile sharp against the setting sun. "I had a father, David. He married my mom when I was 3. He died when I was 16. He was a good man who loved me as his own." She turned back to Alexander. "But I've always wondered." A text message alert broke the moment. Alexander glanced at his phone, frowning. "Problem?" Maya asked. "Nothing that can't wait." He silenced the phone and returned it to his pocket. Would you? Would you be opposed to finding out for certain? A DNA test, you mean? Maya's expression was unreadable. I've considered it. But I need to know. What happens after? If it's positive? Or if it's negative? What then? Do we go our separate ways? Do you write me a check and disappear? What are you looking for here? It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself since reading Catherine's journal. What did he want? To ease his conscience? To make amends? Or something more? Connection. One he hadn't realized he was missing. I don't know what happens next, he said honestly, but I'd like the chance to find out. No expectations, no obligations, just possibility. Maya didn't respond immediately, weighing his words against what she knew of him. What her mother had told her. What she'd observed herself. What the world said about Alexander Westbrook. The ruthless businessman who destroyed competitors without remorse. Okay, she said finally, but on one condition. Name it. You have to let me see where you work, the real you, not the carefully managed version you've been showing me. Alexander hesitated. His world, the boardrooms, the power plays, the calculated decisions, was far removed from Maya. It was a world Catherine had rejected, a world that had ultimately cost him the woman he loved. Would it cost him Maya too? Fair enough, he said at last. Tomorrow. I have a board meeting at 10. Come at 9, and we'll talk after. As they parted ways at the subway entrance, Alexander found himself watching until Maya disappeared into the crowd. Something was shifting within him, rearranging priorities he'd thought immutable. One thing had become abundantly clear. The empire he'd built no longer seemed as important as the truth he might discover. Across town, in an elegant Upper East Side apartment, Victoria Chambers reviewed the file her private investigator had compiled. Photos of Alexander with the girl, Maya lay, spread across her desk. Their meetings, their conversations, their visits to the girl's apartment. Victoria picked up her phone and dialed. He's been seeing her for weeks now, almost daily. She paused, listening. No, I don't think he suspects anything yet. But if he does a DNA test... Another pause. Yes, I understand what's at stake. I'll handle it. She hung up and studied the photos again, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the polished surface of her desk. 20 years of careful planning wouldn't be undone by some girl from Brooklyn. Not when they were so close to completing what they'd started all those years ago, the day Catherine Lewis disappeared from Alexander Westbrook's life. The Westbrook Tower looked different to Maya in the morning light, less intimidating somehow, though no less imposing. She gave her name at the security desk and was surprised when the guard immediately handed her a visitor's badge with her photo already printed on it. Mr. Westbrook said to send you straight up, he explained, directing her to a private elevator. The executive floor was a hive of activity. Assistants hurried through corridors, phones rang constantly, and screens displayed stock prices and news headlines. At the center of it all was Alexander's office, a glass-walled sanctuary that offered both visibility and isolation. Maya. Alexander rose from behind his desk when she entered. He looked different here, his suit impeccable, his posture commanding. This was the Alexander Westbrook the world knew. Thank you for coming. I almost didn't, she admitted, taking in the office, minimalist, expensive, with views that stretched across Manhattan. Nothing personal adorned the space. No photographs, no mementos. Nothing to suggest the man behind the empire. The board meeting starts soon, he said, gesturing to a conference room where people were already gathering. You're welcome to observe. It might be educational. Maya nodded, curious despite herself. And after? After, we have an appointment at a private medical facility for the test. He paused. If you're still willing. I am. The board meeting was indeed educational, though not in the way Alexander had intended. Maya watched from a side chair as he transformed completely. His voice grew colder, his decisions calculated, his patience non-existent. This was the man her mother had feared he would become. when Victoria Chambers entered the room, 15 minutes late and carrying a stack of reports. Maya noticed how Alexander's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Chambers," he acknowledged without warmth. "So good of you to join us." "Traffic?" Victoria replied, taking her seat. Her eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Maya before dismissing her. "Who's your guest?" "My guest is not your concern," Alexander said flatly. "The Monarch acquisition, however, is. You were supposed to have the final numbers yesterday." Victoria smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "And you'll have them by the end of the day." The meeting continued, but Maya found herself watching Victoria rather than Alexander. There was something in the woman's calculating gaze that made her uneasy. After the meeting, as the board members filed out, Victoria lingered, approaching Maya with practiced charm. "Victoria Chambers," she introduced herself. "VP of Operations. And you are?" "Just visiting," Maya replied, not offering her name. Victoria's smile thinned. "Alexander doesn't bring just visitors to board meetings, especially not young women who look so familiar." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so." Alexander returned before Victoria could press further, his expression making it clear the conversation was over. Victoria retreated, but not before giving Maya one last assessing look. "She doesn't like me," Maya observed as they rode the elevator down. "Victoria doesn't like anyone who might threaten her position," Alexander replied. He hesitated, then added, "She and I were involved briefly years ago. It ended badly." "How badly?" "She expected a marriage proposal. I realized I was still in love with someone else." The implication hung between them as they exited the building and entered the waiting car. The medical facility was discreet, located in an unmarked building in Midtown. The procedure itself took less than 5 minutes, a cheek swab for each of them, sealed in separate containers. "Results in 48 hours, the technician informed them. "We'll call you directly, Mr. Westbrook." Outside, rain had begun to fall again, gentle but persistent. They stood under the building's awning, suddenly awkward with each other. "What happens now?" Maya asked, echoing her question from days before. Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that suggested he was seeing something new. "I'd like to show you something if you have time." The car took them out of the city, through the rain-slicked streets, and onto a highway heading north. Maya watched the urban landscape give way to suburbs, then to forested hills. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Westchester County," Alexander replied, "to a house I haven't visited in almost 20 years. The property was hidden behind a long driveway lined with mature trees. The house itself was modest by the standards Alexander could surely afford, a 2-story colonial with a wide porch and gardens that, though overgrown, still showed signs of thoughtful planning. "I bought this place for your mother," Alexander said as they stepped onto the porch, sheltered from the rain. "As a surprise." He retrieved a key from above the doorframe. She never got to see it. Inside, the house was frozen in time, furnished but unlived in, like a museum to what might have been. Sheets covered most of the furniture, but Alexander pulled one back to reveal a living room set arranged around a fireplace. "Why keep it all these years?" Maya asked, running her fingers along a dust-covered bookshelf. "I couldn't bear to sell it," he admitted. "It represented everything I lost, everything I threw away." They moved through the house, room by room, Alexander occasionally sharing what he had envisioned for each space. The kitchen where Catherine would have cooked, the studio where she would have developed her photographs, the bedrooms upstairs, one master suite, and 3 smaller bedrooms. "You wanted children," Maya realized, standing in what would have been a nursery painted in soft yellows and greens. "I wanted a family," Alexander corrected quietly, "with Catherine." The revelation hung between them, weighted with 2 decades of regret. "What changed?" Maya asked. "My mother's journal said you were different when she left, driven, ruthless, willing to do anything to succeed. What happened to that man?" Alexander moved to the window, watching rain stream down the glass. "He built an empire. acquired companies, crushed competitors, accumulated wealth beyond reason. He turned to face her, and he was hollow inside. But you never reached out to her? All those years? Pride, he admitted. Stubbornness. And then time passed, and it seemed too late. He paused. I looked for her once, about 10 years ago. The investigator I hired said she was married. Happy. I thought I had no right to disrupt that. Maya absorbed this, comparing it to what she knew of her mother's life. She was happy, she confirmed. But she never stopped loving you, even after everything. In the growing darkness, they lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the sheet-covered couch, the only sounds the crackle of flames and rain against the windows. I've made a decision, Alexander said finally. Regardless of what the test shows, I want you to have this house. Mina started to protest, but he raised a hand to stop her. Not as charity, not as compensation, but because Catherine should have had it. And you're her daughter. He met her eyes steadily. It's yours. Whatever you choose to do with it. Before Maya could respond, Alexander's phone rang. He frowned at the display. I need to take this. Excuse me. He stepped into the hallway, his voice low but tense. When he returned, his expression had darkened. We need to go back to the city, he said, his CEO persona slipping back into place. There's a situation at the company. The drive back was mostly silent, Alexander making calls while Maya watched the rain-swept landscape pass by. Something had shifted between them again. Not a closing off exactly, but a reminder of the vastly different worlds they inhabited. At her apartment building, Alexander walked her to the door despite the rain. I'm sorry about this, he said. The test results will come when they come. Maya finished for him. It's okay. You have an empire to run. The words could have been bitter, but they weren't, just a simple acknowledgement of reality. What neither of them noticed was the car parked across the street or the woman inside, watching their goodbye with calculating eyes. Victoria Chambers lowered her camera and reached for her phone. It's worse than we thought, she said when her call was answered. They've done a DNA test. She listened for a moment. Yes, I've taken care of that. The results will show whatever we want them to. Another pause. No, that won't be necessary, yet. Let's see how he reacts to the news first. She ended the call and continued watching as Alexander returned to his car. 20 years of patient planning, of carefully working her way into Alexander's company and his life, all leading to the Monarch acquisition that would finally give her what she'd always wanted. Control of Westbrook Industries. Catherine Lewis had nearly ruined everything once before. Victoria wouldn't allow her daughter to finish what Catherine had started. The test results came on a Tuesday afternoon. Alexander was in the middle of a tense negotiation meeting when his private line rang. He excused himself, aware of Victoria's eyes following him as he stepped into the hallway. Mr. Westbrook. The doctor's voice was clinical, professional. We have your results. Alexander closed his eyes suddenly, unsure if he was ready for this truth. Go ahead. The test indicates with 99.7% certainty that you are not the biological father of Maya Lewis. The words hit like a physical blow. Alexander leaned against the wall, his mind racing. Not her father. The possibility he hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge, that Maya might be his daughter, had become more important to him than he'd realized. Thank you, doctor, he managed, ending the call. He stood motionless, processing what this meant. Maya wasn't his daughter. The connection he'd felt, the strange familiarity, it had all been wishful thinking. Or perhaps just Catherine's echo in her daughter's features and mannerisms. When he returned to the meeting, his face betrayed nothing of his inner turmoil. Victoria studied him curiously, but said nothing as they finalized the terms of the Monarch acquisition, the deal that would cement Westbrook Industries as the dominant force in their industry. Later that evening, as Alexander sat alone in his penthouse, Catherine's journal opened before him. Something nagged at his mind. He reread her last entry, dated just months before her death. I still dream of the life we might have had, Alexander. The house you described. The garden I would plant. The family we would build. I wonder if you ever think of it too. I wonder if you've ever realized what was stolen from us both. Stolen. An odd choice of words. Alexander frowned, flipping back through earlier entries. Catherine had been specific about why she left. His changing values, his ruthless ambition, his willingness to compromise his once firm ethics. But nowhere had she suggested anything had been stolen from them. On impulse, he called his head of security. I need you to look into something, he said. The DNA test I took recently. I want to know if anyone could have interfered with the results. His phone rang an hour later as he was leaving for Maya's apartment. He needed to tell her in person. She deserved that much. Sir, his security chief sounded troubled. There was a breach. Someone accessed the medical facility system yesterday and altered records. Can you determine the original results? Working on it. But sir, the access point was traced back to Westbrook Tower, 15th floor. Victoria's floor. The pieces suddenly aligned with terrible clarity. Victoria's late arrival at the board meeting, her interest in Maya, the Monarch acquisition that she had pushed so aggressively, a deal that would restructure the company leadership. Alexander changed direction, heading back to the office instead of to Brooklyn. Security footage confirmed his suspicions. Victoria had returned to the building late the previous night, working alone in her office for hours. He was reviewing financial records when his private investigator called with news about Victoria's recent communications. What he learned chilled him. Victoria had been working with Jonathan Reeves, CEO of Monarch and Alexander's oldest rival, for years. The acquisition wasn't a merger. It was a calculated takeover designed to push Alexander out. And Catherine, what role had she played in all this? Alexander returned to the journal, reading between the lines with new understanding. Catherine hadn't left solely because of his changed values. She discovered something about Victoria and Reeves. His phone rang again. Sir, we recovered the original test results. Alexander held his breath. The DNA test shows a 99.9% probability that you are the biological father of Maya Lewis. The world shifted on its axis. Maya, his daughter, his and Catherine's child. The realization hit him with staggering force. Victoria had altered the results. She'd known, perhaps had always known, about Maya. Had she been behind Catherine's sudden departure 20 years ago? Had she orchestrated it all to clear her path to Alexander and eventually to control his company? He reached for his phone to call Maya, then hesitated. This wasn't something to share over the phone, and there was something else he needed to do first. The confrontation with Victoria in her office was brief but devastating. Faced with the evidence Alexander presented, she didn't bother denying it. You were never supposed to meet her, Victoria said coldly. Catherine was supposed to disappear completely. I didn't count on her sending the girl to find you after all these years. You drove Catherine away, Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet. You threatened her. Victoria smiled thinly. I gave her a choice, leave you, or I destroy everything you were building. She chose to protect you, even knowing what you become without her. She shrugged elegantly. I underestimated her sentimentality. Sending the girl to you with that journal, a clever final move. You're finished at Westbrook, Alexander said, and the Monarch deal is dead. Victoria's smile didn't waver. We'll see. By morning, Victoria Chambers had been escorted from the building. The Monarch acquisition had been canceled, and Alexander Westbrook stood at Maya's door in Brooklyn, his heart racing like it hadn't in 20 years. When she opened the door, her eyes were guarded. You got the results. Yes, he said. May I come in? Inside, he told her everything. The manipulated test. Victoria's confession. The truth that had been hidden from them both for over 2 decades. You're my daughter, Maya, he said finally. If you'll allow it, I'd very much like the chance to be your father. Maya sat silently, absorbing the revelation. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. Mom always said I had my father's determination. She looked up at him, her eyes, his eyes, bright with unshed tears. I think I'd like to see if she was right about that. Later, they walked together to the cemetery where Catherine was buried. Alexander placed a bouquet of wildflowers, her favorite, on the simple headstone. I found her, he said softly, just like you knew I would. As they stood together, father and daughter united at last, Alexander felt Catherine's presence in the gentle breeze that stirred the flowers. 20 years of empty ambition and hollow success fell away, replaced by something he'd forgotten how to recognize: hope. The empire he built would continue. But now it had purpose, a legacy not just of wealth and power, but of family, of second chances, of love rediscovered in the next generation. Let's go home, Alexander said, taking his daughter's hand. And together they did.